So, hello and welcome to 11FS Spotlight. I'm Benjamin Ensor, Director of Research at 11FS. In this weekly show, we shine a spotlight on the best and the brightest in the tech and financial services industries to try and understand what gets them going, growing, and what they think the future of the industry will look like. On today's Spotlight, I'm delighted to be joined by Helen Lord, Chief Executive of the Vulnerability Registration Service. How are you doing today, Helen?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Excellent. So on the show today, we're going to be talking about your career, Helen, and discuss the findings of a recent survey of UK adults that was carried out on behalf of the Vulnerability Registration Service. So let's start off. Can you give us a sort of 1-minute description of what the Vulnerability Registration Service is and what it does?
Yeah, sure. I mean, effectively, Vulnerability Registration Service, VRS, we've created it to help organisations in any sector really, but primarily financial services, to identify vulnerability in their customers, to help them treat them in the right way and help them through the process of dealing with them. So we're a central hub whereby vulnerable consumers can tell us and we can tell organisations on their behalf.
Fantastic. Can you give us a little bit more about your background and what led you to where you are today? What got you interested in this? How did you get to become chief executive of the VRS?
Okay, so my background, really going back very early days, I think I started off like everybody else, not entirely knowing what I was going to do after university, but I'd done a lot of temporary work for an organisation which was then called CCN Systems in Nottingham, which is now what is Experian, which is obviously the huge credit reference agency that we all know. So I spent 20 years with Experian, and I sort of started off doing very, very basic admin task data inputting. I then eventually was running their consumer facing department, which was dealing with thousands and thousands of consumers each day, branching off into looking at fraud, compliance, data protection, that side of things. So I was there for 20 years. When I left, I did a lot of data protection consultancy. GDPR was just coming to the fore. A lot of organisations were getting very frightened, I suppose, about the implications of big fines and what GDPR and new data protection guidelines would bring to play. So a lot of consultancy with all sorts of different organisations. And then while doing that, the subject of vulnerability was coming more and more to the fore. And so I was working with some ex-colleagues, some other contacts, and we really felt that, okay, we're all talking about vulnerability, but do we actually know who is vulnerable and how to identify them? And to us at the time, what seemed like a very simple solution was something we decided to move forward. And I guess as time's gone on, it's been clear that it's perhaps not as simple as we thought, but the concept remains true. And it's a very, very straightforward thing. If somebody tells you they're vulnerable, then surely we should be taking that into consideration. So yeah, from very sort of basic, doing things like learning on the job literally, to running a big department, and then leaving a big organisation that I suppose I grew up with, and then dealing with many, many different organisations of very many different sizes.
So presumably, in the course of your career, you've come across many vulnerable customers and seen some of the difficult circumstances that people end up in for one reason or another.
Yeah. I mean, I think very much so I mean, running a big customer service team, certainly in the early parts of my career, you're dealing with a lot of individuals. And in that context, they were looking at the credit report. So complicated financial documents that, you can't take for granted that people understand. And I think the reality, people were desperately trying to get credit. They potentially were in debt and often were very vulnerable and very, very overwhelmed. So in a career scenario, that I've certainly seen that firsthand.
Is there a sort of definition of vulnerability? I mean, I'm sure that we understand I think everyone understands what vulnerability is. You sort of know it when you see it, but is there a way to recognize that a person is vulnerable? Is it just up to the person themselves to say, I feel vulnerable? Or is there a way of sort of recognizing, this person's probably having some difficulty, they probably are vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to put labels on people, isn't it? And I think the word vulnerable is contentious in itself. And there's been a lot of noise about that. Should we use that word? But then again, what do you call it? Is a stigma attached to it? And I think what you have to accept is different things affect people in different ways. If somebody is struggling with debt, it might tip over into mental health issues. For another person, they might be able to ride it. Other people might deal with debt on a day-to-day basis, and it might almost be a way of life. So I think it really, really does depend on the individual, and to some extent, you have to allow them to identify that themselves. That's not to say there aren't trigger points that we shouldn't be looking for, and there isn't monitoring that we shouldn't be doing. And there's a lot of models out there that are predicting vulnerability, and I think that's the right thing to do. But what they can't do is predict that an individual is going to have a bereavement hit them, or a financial or a sort of relationship breakdown that's going to then put them in a vulnerable position. That just happens to individuals, and individuals react to it in different ways.
Of course. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment because I was thinking about how the impossibility of predicting some of the events that hit people. I know. I think there's a growing understanding of the relationship between mental health and financial health, and also growing sort of recognition that many adults have mental health issues at some point in their lives, and they're not necessarily permanent, they can be temporary. So hopefully that stigma, or any stigma attached, is gradually diminishing. But let's talk a little bit more about the bigger picture, and in particular the survey that you've recently done of, I think, about 2,000 British adults, and how you're sort of using that to try and understand people, and how we as an industry can make sure financial services are inclusive and fair. Can you tell us a bit more about the survey?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, what we did, looking at the people that were starting to register with us, and it is a growing database, but we wanted to try and really understand who was registering with us and get an understanding of those. So that was the starting point. So we did a lot of sort of anonymous profiling around it, and looked, we found out that a lot of younger people are more inclined to put their hand up and say they're vulnerable. And then we wanted to really go out and ask people, certainly about their experience in the last 12 months, because clearly, or the last 18 months, because clearly lockdown, COVID has hit people in many, many different ways. Has it affected their mental health? Has it affected their capacity to pay things? So we wanted to really look at that. And I think the other thing we were very keen to understand is, do people actually want to put their hand up and say they're vulnerable? Do people actually want that information shared to help them? So it was really out there as an information gauging exercise to understand if they wanted that help, and to understand how they really felt that they were being treated. Because I think it's an area, it's very easy to make assumptions based upon personal experience and everything. So we wanted a broader view around it.
And what did you find? I mean, because you made a really interesting point about, well, you made a number of interesting points about, younger people perhaps being a little bit more open to it, or a little bit more willing to acknowledge it. But you also saying you were asking people whether they were willing to say that they were vulnerable. What did you find?
Overwhelmingly, yes, people are happy to share it, because that's one of the fears from organisations dealing with vulnerable customers. Do they really want to share that information? And about 64% of people said yes, they would share it, and they also expected organisations to act upon that information if they shared it. So clearly, some people don't want to, and that's fair enough. You can't take that forward. But if they do want to share it, and they've got the bravery and the courage to put their hands up and say, yes, I've got a mental health issue, or whatever it may be, then I think that in itself justifies that being taken into consideration. And I mean, yes, I think there's more acknowledgement of things like mental health, particularly in younger people. And I think that's just the way society's moved on. I don't know if there's a certain amount of stoicism in the older generation where they're not, they don't consider themselves to be vulnerable, but clearly that needs addressing as well. I mean, you only have to look at the statistics around, say, the number of people who have dementia in the UK. So what's that, about 850, 900,000 people? Well, there's no question they're vulnerable, whether they consider themselves to be or not. So there's different approaches to it, I guess.
Definitely. So you obviously know a lot about this topic because of your career and all the conversations you've had over the years and so on. But were there things that you found in the survey that surprised you? Did the findings sort of meet the hypotheses that you had when you set out, or did you come across a few things where you thought, wow, that's worse than I thought, or possibly better than I thought?
I think there were over 10% of people that actually thought they were at risk of eviction or homelessness. Now, to me, that seemed a very high number of people to be in a very precarious position. Now, obviously, it's a survey. It doesn't go down and define how close they feel to that state, but that's a high number of people. And then there's a lot of people that certainly through lockdown and the circumstances it's brought to bear, there's a lot of people that are in problems in terms of priority debt, and that will be maybe council tax, utilities, etc. And they may be prioritising financial service debt over paying the rent in some cases, because another thing I've certainly found through the work I've done with driving VRS forward, people don't know what priority debt is. So they might be risking their home while trying to pay a credit card bill that they might have had for a couple of years. So there's that balance as well. I think one of the biggest surprises was possibly the slant towards the younger people. And if I was to draw you a graph, it is very distinct. Younger people consider themselves to be vulnerable, and the older they get, the less likely they are to do so. So I think that's a lesson we should all learn as a starting point. And I suppose the other thing that also brings to bear, but younger people are often not necessarily that high up on the radar because they haven't perhaps built themselves a credit history. They're not that active, whereas people, say my age, have been around a long time and are quite visible in those arenas.
Yes, I definitely recognise that sort of stoicism that you talk about in older generations. But one of the things I'm really shocked by is that statistic you said of 1 in 10 British adults fearing that they're at risk of eviction. I mean, that's 5 million adults in the UK alone, and presumably the patterns are very similar in other countries. So that's millions of people living in fear of losing their homes. That's shocking.
Yeah, and I suppose it depends. Do they see that as a possibility, or do they see that as an imminent probability? And I suppose there's a range of that. But even to have that fear in your mind, it is significant, I think.
Yeah, and that, I said earlier how, financial health and mental health are linked, and you can see how that kind of financial stress and worry can affect people's mental health. So, wow. Let's switch a little bit to how firms are treating customers, because I think another part of your survey was really looking at, and part of your whole purpose in the Vulnerability Registration Service is to really try and improve the way that firms treat vulnerable customers. Are there organisations that are treating vulnerable customers unfairly? You talked about the sort of credit card debt that people are prioritising and so on. Are there a lot of bad practices happening in the industry today that you're aware of?
Yeah, I think there are sectors that are doing better than others, and there are organisations that are doing better than others. There is a lot of awareness about vulnerability, and there are a lot of people with job titles with vulnerability in them. I think there is still a long way to go in terms of implementing solutions and having it really embedded in the way organisations manage their customers. So I think there's a willingness there, there's an appetite there. So, and there's sometimes regulatory drivers, and it depends how strong those are. So particularly, we talk a lot to people in collections, we talk to people a lot in the water industry around vulnerability. and to an extent government around driving solutions through and identifying vulnerability. But I mean, on the other side of things, I mean, we talked, one of the big areas where there's an issue in terms of vulnerable people obtaining credit lines when they shouldn't do, and is telecoms and getting mobile phones, etc. And we are thus far struggling a little bit to have some of those conversations.
That's interesting. So you're saying that some of the telecoms companies are sort of behaving poorly here. I was interested to hear you saying the water companies are perhaps a good example. That might be a surprise to some of our listeners. I wouldn't. It's not often that the financial services industry is taking lessons from the water industry. Is there something that the water industry is doing that people should be learning from?
I think there's, again, a lot of this will always be driven by the regulator. There's pressure, I think, from Ofwat around water. Energy water providers have always had their own priority service codes to identify different types of vulnerability. I think where they are spreading out a little bit is looking at sharing that information cross-sector and potentially trying to get a better understanding as well around financial vulnerability, as opposed to, somebody having a disability that they have to flag up. They also have to take into consideration where people may be eligible for discounted tariffs and that side of things. So that's where they've moved forward. And when you see that sort of general coming together and really looking at it, things do start to move quite quickly.
Very interesting. So a lot of our listeners are international. So some of the people watching this will be international. Are there other countries that you know of that are maybe handling this quite well? I mean, because as you said, some of this is down to regulations and good regulations. Are there other countries that you know of that have tackled this a little bit better than the UK?
Not better than the UK. I mean, the way I see our model is, as I said at the beginning, it's very simple, and I think it probably could be replicated in any geography. I'm seeing more noise in the likes of, say, Australia, where I think they've got regulation around the corner in October, I believe. Possibly movement in the Netherlands. I think one of our challenges in the UK, which I'm seeing perhaps doesn't happen to the same extent in the US, for example, is that we have quite a lot of pockets of bureaucracy, quite a lot of trade associations, quite a lot of regulators. And all of those are great, but it also means you've got to navigate your way around all of those to bring people together. And a data sharing model involves people providing you with data and people searching it. And I know that sounds obvious, but one is dependent upon the other, and you have to get that sort of snowball effect to really make it work.
So let's talk a bit about how people communicate, that they are vulnerable, because as you said at the beginning, it's to some extent it's up to people to say that they're vulnerable, but then and you also said that younger people were more willing to do that than older people. But let's say you are vulnerable and you're vulnerable. What do you then do about it? How do people communicate that with organizations, banks and insurance companies or whoever?
Well, I think typically, so taking the VRS out of the equation, obviously that's a way to communicate, but it's typically through dealing with customer service departments. So your success in getting that message across, and going back to the survey, we've seen quite a lot of frustration about the amount of time it takes to get that message across and get that message across to the right people. You are dependent upon being put through to the right person and them acting upon the fact that you're vulnerable. Now it's dependent upon the organisation then, whether they take that into consideration and what they do with that, and whether they have a select team that will deal with them or whether they'll deal with that person differently. So in a sense, it's a little bit of a lottery depending on how you're dealing with somebody. And I mean, I could have a conversation with a bank, and I have had conversations with banks that have said, we know who our vulnerable customers are. Well, hopefully you do. doubt you're going to know who all of them are, but equally that customer of yours is going to be potentially dealing with another 20 different organizations. They're going to have mobile phones, they're going to have energy providers, they're going to have pensions, they're going to have insurance, and you start to tot it all up. That vulnerable consumer is potentially going to have that conversation with every single one of those. So the ideal around, or the sort of ambition with data sharing, is that they don't have to have that detailed conversation with each call centre, find the right person and explain themselves every single time.
I'm interested in what you were saying about organizations believing that they know which of their customers are vulnerable, because as you said earlier, that vulnerability can, it can be a long-term thing for someone, but it can also come on very suddenly because of a breakdown of a relationship, a divorce, losing a job, a sudden bereavement, losing a very close family member. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why someone can become vulnerable potentially relatively quickly that presumably organizations can't predict.
And that, I think, goes back to what I was saying about having a predictive model about vulnerability. Now, you might be able to look to see if somebody is going to dip into serious debt. You might be able to look at their affordability, but exactly as you just said, you can't predict a bereavement. You can't predict how that's going to affect somebody. You can't predict how a divorce, for example, is going to affect somebody. It might be a long time coming. It might be a sudden thing. These things just cannot be predicted, really.
One of the things I was really sort of shocked about when I looked at your survey was, or maybe shocked is the wrong word, dismayed by, was the point that you were making about individuals with sort of low levels of knowledge and confidence in finances, which wasn't so surprising, but also people with low levels of English language, low levels of literacy, and those people actually also often being some of the most vulnerable and being the people who had the most difficulty communicating that through to organizations. My heart goes out to people in these situations of sort of, as you said, and being passed from pillar to post within organizations.
I think we start, particularly probably in the financial services industry, and I'm as guilty as anybody of this, that you can have an assumption that there's a level of understanding, and it is a complicated world. So, as you say, if somebody's got low level of literacy, if their English language isn't brilliant, or if they're elderly, and they're being channeled through the internet, it is a challenge, and it can be quite overwhelming to try and break through that. I mean, we do a lot about self-help, and I think sometimes vulnerable people very much don't want to have that conversation and explain their circumstances to people. So the internet may be a good route if they can deal with it without having that face-to-face interaction. But equally, there's a big subset, I guess, of people who aren't in a position to get that self-help over the internet. So I think we have to tailor our communication methods and to the audience, which means having a bit more understanding about them.
So one of the trickier issues here, presumably, is that even with the sort of best will in the world, there are going to be people who are vulnerable who are not aware of it. You talked about sort of early onset dementia as an example, and there's going to be some other examples as well, where someone is vulnerable and either isn't aware of it or isn't willing to admit it because of that sort of stoicism or whatever. Is there a way where the relatives of that person can help? Obviously you sometimes get people, stepping in to manage the finances of a relative who's unwell or whatever.
Yeah.
How do carers and relatives get involved? Is there a way for them to do that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of ways really. Power of attorney is a brilliant thing if you manage to get one in place at the right time. And I mean, it was one of my personal drivers for pushing VRS further. My father had Alzheimer's, and you sort of see somebody who's very, very capable and then gradually becomes less and less able to manage their affairs. And if you have a power of attorney in place, it reaches a point where you're thinking, no, this person shouldn't be dealing with their own financial affairs shouldn't be obtaining credit. And I mean, we hear lots of people with mental health issues who suddenly, almost apply for things, buy things that they wouldn't typically do. So where there's a power of attorney in place, if I had one over a parent, I could register on their behalf, and we just validate that. We also work with local authorities, solicitors, estate management companies, where a court of protection order is in place. So where the individual hasn't got the mental capacity to manage their own financial affairs, and they are being managed, say, by that local authority, and they can provide us with that information because they have the authority to do so. So working with third parties is a massively important thing to do. That doesn't, take away the fact somebody might be vulnerable. They don't want to go and shout about it or tell anyone. That's fine. That's their prerogative. But if they are in a situation where they do need safeguarding and they're not in a position to do that themselves, there are ways of doing it.
Do you think, why do you think people choose not to disclose their vulnerability? I mean, people who are vulnerable, and I realize that there are some obvious answers, but maybe there are some less obvious answers.
I think certainly our survey said there's still things like people think it might affect the way they are treated by an organisation in a negative way. They think it may impact their creditworthiness. So, is an organisation going to see, there's somebody's vulnerable, we're not going to deal with them? I still think, and there is still stigma attached to it to an extent, and there's a pride involved in it. But having said that, I'd still go back to the fact, 64% of people are saying they are quite happy to put the hand up and say if they're in a vulnerable situation.
Okay. So, Helen, how could, so people who work at banks or insurance companies are watching this, how can they go about working with the vulnerability registration service? How can they sort of take advantage? Oh, sorry, that's the wrong word. How can they harness, the good work that you're doing?
It's very, very simple. I mean, our technology is simple. It's all we do. There's no sort of different aspects to what we're doing. We're trying to make the information available to as many authorised or appropriate organisations as we possibly can in the way it will work for them best. So, as I say, straightforward API technology, plug it into where they want to plug it into on their customer journey, whether that's in collections, whether it's in customer service, whether it's in new business, when somebody's applying for finance. So we can work with them and do it. And you're not talking about, we're a not-for-profit organisation. There is obviously a cost involved in it. In searching the database, there is no cost associated with anybody registering whatever source that comes from, but the cost is minimal in the great scheme of things if you compare it to things like credit reference checks, fraud prevention checks, affordability checks. So it is straightforward. The other thing we try and do is work with as many organisations as we possibly can who already provide solutions to, say, financial services. So if there's collection solutions, fraud prevention solutions, or whatever that is, we will work with those to make sure that the end user has as an easier an access as they possibly can, because I'm very conscious that plugging a new data source in somewhere is not always simple and impacts tech resource.
Yeah, I was wondering, because you mentioned you'd spent part of your career at Experian. I was wondering whether you're integrated into any of the sort of credit reference databases or things like that yet.
Yeah, and we aren't yet. We are talking to the credit reference agencies, and that is something I'm very keen to make sure happens, because it's an obvious place for the information to go out easily.
Okay. So last quick question about sort of vulnerability. Are there any big organizations or small organizations that are on the right path? Are there some sort of good examples or good practices that others can learn from? Are there, I don't know, one or two firms where you say, their heart's in the right place, they're trying to do the right things? I'm sure nobody's perfect because this is a really complex problem. But are there any organizations where you say, they're on the right track?
I think the big retailers, if I want a better description, sort of online sort of mail order type organisations, I think that's where they are really, really keen to move forward. And some of the big names are keen to do this. I would say there is no trend. There is. I couldn't say this sector or this industry is the one that's definitely leading the path. It's definitely down to the organisation. There's nobody saying they don't want to do it ever. I mean, I don't really have conversations where anybody say no, that's a bad idea. The appetite's always there. It might be we haven't got the resource yet, or we need you to have a bigger database or to have more users, but there is always the appetite to do it. So it's just moving that forward, I guess.
Okay, so it's really something about individuals championing this as a cause within their organizations, just like you have.
Yeah.
Okay. So as we're coming towards the end of the show, we want to finish off by sort of asking you one last question, which you can answer however you'd like, whether related to fintech or vulnerability or not. What advice would you give your younger self? So looking back over your career, what advice would you give yourself?
I think probably having sort of gone on quite a bit of a journey with the vulnerability registration service over the last few years, and it is a case of being doggedly determined, because there are barriers in the way, and having the belief that it is the right thing to do. I would say it's having the courage of your own convictions and real belief in what you're doing. And that's not to say don't listen to people or take other people's views on board, because that's very, very important. But really if you're convinced it's the right thing to do, then really try and follow that through. And I think that's something I feel that I've probably learned later on in my career. I probably wouldn't have had the confidence when I was younger. If somebody had said, "Oh, I'm not sure about that," I'd have probably taken that as read. Whereas now I probably am too awkward to.
No, I think that's good advice. I come across many smart young people who don't have the courage of their convictions, and they're often completely right, and they just need to be a little bit braver. All right. So what's next for you? Do you have sort of other big ambitions? What's next for you, or for the VRS? Any sort of big challenges?
My ambition for the VRS, and there's a long way to go with it, but my ambition is that to do a vulnerability check is a given as part of an application process or a customer management process. In the same way, you wouldn't lend somebody £1,000 without checking that you were going to get it back. I think it should be a given that you check to make sure that if somebody's flagged up they're vulnerable, and take that into consideration and try and deal with them in the same way.
Love it. Okay, everybody, it's coming to the end of the show. Thank you so much, Helen, for joining me. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I think this is a really interesting topic, really important topic, actually, more to the point. Where can people find out more about you and everything that you're getting up to?
I mean, the best place is really to check out our website, vulnerabilityregistrationservice.co.uk. We have a presence on LinkedIn. We do regular webinars which are free to attend, and they're all advertised on LinkedIn. And we have interesting speakers, and we give updates on VRS.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen.
Okay.
Right. That's all we've got time for this week. So make sure you follow 11FS on LinkedIn, and so you can subscribe and never miss an episode. Go and visit the 11FS YouTube channel where you can catch up on previous episodes. Have a great week, everyone. Thank you, Helen. Thank you all for listening, and goodbye.